he and her, and I'm one of the consultants at Inclusive Employers. And I'll be guiding you through this webinar for Tuesday of National Inclusion Week, which where we'll be exploring trans awareness. And I'm joined by our speaker today. I'm delighted to introduce him.
Hello everyone, I'm Addison Barnett. I'm also one of the consultants here at Inclusive Employers. I'm a trans man and I use he, him pronouns.
Before we start, I just wanted to give a huge thank you to everyone. So Inclusive Employers set up National Inclusion Week 7 years ago. And each year, thanks to the energy and commitment and determination of so many of our members and other organisations, the week is going from strength to strength. So thank you to all of you. 2019 has been the biggest and best so far. And it's certainly thanks to all of the team at Inclusive Employers, but also our headline sponsor for 2019, who's McDonald's UK and Ireland. Thank you, McDonald's. We're so grateful, and thank you in particular to Mita Zakaria and the Women's Leadership Group at McDonald's for their amazing ideas, dedication and passion to make hashtag Everyday Inclusion a reality. If you'd like to find out more about National Inclusion Week and how other organisations are participating, you can go to Twitter and look at hashtag Everyday Inclusion. And also McDonald's have their own hashtag hello, and we'll be posting updates throughout the week on both of those channels. So before we kick off, I just want to do a bit of housekeeping. So if you can hear us okay, can you please type hello into the chat box function? And we'll just spend a few minutes just checking. Oh, wow, loads of people can hear us. That's brilliant news. Fantastic. Okay. And the technology seems to be working all right. Just to say that if you have any problems with the sound, please type into the chat or call Zainab. And you've got her number in your joining instructions. But in case you don't have them to hand, it's 0207 803 0689. And we'll try our best to help. I'll be keeping tabs on your questions, so you can type into the chat box at any point, and I'll be keeping an eye on the questions as we move through. Please do ask questions as we go, and we'll try and answer them across the whole webinar. The session's also going to be recorded, and you will get a recording within about a week. So what we're going to cover over the next hour. So today, it's really a taster of trans inclusion. It's intended to be a really quick introduction. We'll be launching our trans resource pack and further information in November. So there'll be a lot more in-depth information and specific guidance that you'll be able to tap into. So please do keep an eye out for those. But the aim of today is to give a basic foundation of trans identities, to touch on the legislation, to spend some time, most importantly, discussing some of the common challenges that trans people face in the workplace. And there'll also be time for questions at the end. So as I've said already, please do use the chat function for that, and we'll do our best, and I'll keep an eye on it. So I'm going to hand over to Addy now to get us kicked off. Addy, I think a lot of people tend to worry about the terminology, which words they should use when they're talking about trans people. And I think it makes people quite anxious to say or do the wrong thing. Can you give us an overview of some of the key terms and explain why we use them and so on?
Absolutely. This is something I hear a lot. People understandably get quite anxious about terminology and the kind of words that they need to use. One thing to remember is that language is alive, so it changes frequently. There's not a sort of set printed dictionary of sort of trans terminology to use, and in the trans community we use different words depending on our age, our background, our nationality, etc. I especially find that people who are under 25 have a lot more sort of complex and varied vocabulary than people who are older. So there's sort of two key concepts that are useful to understand when it comes to trans identities. The first is that gender is assigned at birth. So what that means is when we're born, the doctor looks at us and says, this is a boy or this is a girl. As a baby, we don't have a lot of say in that, especially at that point, because we've just been born and we're trying to work out what on earth's going on. What this means is that everyone has a gender identity The gender we're assigned at birth is our gender identity that the world kind of gives us. If that gender that we're given when we're born feels like the right one, then we're cisgender. If it doesn't, then we're transgender. So that's kind of two of the key terms there. The second key concept is that gender, especially in Western cultures, is seen as a binary. So a binary is when something is either sort of on or off. So the way that this applies to gender is that it's often seen as being an either or choice. So you can either be male or female. There's no other options. This affects all of us, and it's quite a simplistic way of looking at gender, and it doesn't really represent the full spectrum of human experience. So if any of you have experienced any kind of discrimination, or people have told you that you shouldn't behave a certain way or dress a certain way or like certain things because of your gender, that's the sort of gender binary in action. The gender binary is what tells us that women can't be leaders and men can't be caregivers. It's those kind of messages. It's restrictive for everybody. So with those kind of two concepts in mind, and they're things to sort of think about in a bit more depth, some actual definitions of some of the words that are up on the screen. So as I said earlier, a trans person is someone whose gender differs from what they were assigned when they were born. Trans people might identify as male or female, a trans man or a trans woman, or they might feel that neither of those labels really fits them, and they might identify as non-binary or agender or something else. There are lots of different words and they change. So the key is to partly get the two concepts in your head, that gender is something we're given at birth and for some people it doesn't quite work, and that gender identity is bigger and more complex than just man or woman, male or female. So cisgender is literally the opposite of transgender. It's sometimes sort of shortened to cis, and it's not an insult, it's not a slur. Cisgender is when the gender you were given when you were born is the right one for you. So if you've grown up not really thinking about your gender very much at all, and the gender that you have, male or female, feels kind of right, then you're cisgender, basically. Trans people may transition, and transitioning is the sort of various steps taken to feel more at home in one's gender identity. Transition isn't a fixed process, and it's not a sort of a set path for everyone. Different people in the trans community approach transition in different ways, and we kind of do what feels right to us. So people might change their name and their pronouns. So they might go from using he, him to they, them, for example. They might change how they dress. And some trans people also choose a medical transition. So they might access hormones and or surgery. The key way to think about transitioning is that it's like a toolbox of options. And as trans people, we kind of choose which bits out of the toolbox feel right for us. Dead naming is a word that I'm seeing used sort of outside the trans community a bit more. I think awareness of what it is growing, so I think it's a useful one to touch on. So dead naming is when you use a trans person's previous name that they no longer use. It can be traumatic for a trans person to experience being called by their dead name, and it should never be something that you do against a trans person's wishes. The best way to think about a dead name, and part of the reason why it's such a sort of strong word, it's that word dead names come from the trans community, it's come from us, is because of how serious it can feel if someone uses your previous name when you no longer use that name. So it should be considered confidential, and if you use someone's dead name against their wishes, then that can be considered harassment. So that's a really important thing to think about. I think it's useful in the terms of in the workplace, seeing as it in the sort of almost in the realms of GDPR. So the information that you have on people, you need to think really carefully about where that goes, who can see it, who can access it. And finally, pronouns, which we've touched on a bit already. They're the words that you use instead of someone's name. So he, she, or they are the most common ones. The kind of rule of thumb for pronouns is to bear in mind that how someone looks, so their presentation, and how they identify, so their gender identity, are not always the same. So you shouldn't assume what pronoun or name to use. So for some people, he and she aren't comfortable words for them, and they prefer gender neutral pronouns such as they. A lot of non-binary people use they pronouns, for instance. Sam Smith recently very publicly came out as using they, them pronouns, and those of you that sort of followed it in the news saw that there was quite a mixed response to that. And I think the response that Sam Smith had to coming out as using they, them pronouns is pretty indicative of what a lot of non-binary people face. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Debbie now, who's going to touch a bit on the law around this area.
Okay, I'm just trying to move the slide. What's happening there? Okay, I'm having trouble. We're going to just move to the next slide. Oh, thank you so much. So in terms of the legislation, trans people are covered by the Equality Act 2010 under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And so this would cover all the standard forms of prohibited conduct that you would see against other protected characteristics like gender and race, for example. So people who have transitioned are protected, well, either before, during, or after their transition from direct discrimination. So that would be any form of discrimination based directly on their protected characteristic. So, for example, if someone, didn't receive a job offer because there were concerns by the employer that they had transitioned, indirect discrimination, harassment, victimization, discrimination by perception, and associative discrimination. So it would apply in exactly the same way as it would for any other protected characteristic. There are also a couple of other areas. Gender Recognition Act 2014, and this protects trans people this enables trans people to change their gender to the correct gender on their birth certificate. And the Act also includes safeguards for people around their privacy, so that any information in relation to that process of applying and obtaining a gender recognition certificate is protected information. And if someone who would acquire that information in an official capacity would be breaking the law if they disclose it without the consent of the individual concerned. And just like everybody else, trans people are protected under the data protection regulations. And so their information is personal, and it's also sensitive personal data. So again, disclosure would be breaking the law. So those are the kind of key areas of the legislation that we just wanted to let you know about. Addy, I think it'd be really helpful now to look at the experience of trans people in the workplace.
Okay, so as I was saying earlier, we wanted to do a kind of quick fly past the legislation, but the legislation is one thing and the sort of reality of trans people in the workplace is another. So you can see from the slides here that trans people's experience at work is not great in the vast majority of instances. So the statistics that are up on the slide now are from a survey in 2018 by Crossland Solicitors, and they surveyed 1,000 employers from sort of a cross-section of industries to get a sort of sense of what the experience was really like out there. So looking at some of these stats, less than 25% of employers are aware of the laws protecting trans workers. Only 2% of employers offer a transitioning at work policy to support staff. Only 2% have gender neutral toilets. And probably the biggest one for me is that the statistic at the bottom, 1 in 3 employers admitted they were less likely to hire a trans person than a cisgender person when recruiting, means that trans people can't even get through the door into the workplace, let alone succeed and move through it and contribute. So you're looking at sort of quite significant barriers to trans people being included at work, which is partly why this webinar exists, but it also shows that there's quite a long way to go in terms of trans inclusion in the workplace.
Okay, so we know at Inclusive Employers that that there are common issues that trans people face in the workplace, and these tend to be grouped into three themes. The first is around the systems an organisation uses, so things like the databases, its HR system, its IT login, any kind of survey or data collection exercises, recruitment portals, IDs, etc. The second area tends to be around buildings and facilities, so things like toilets, changing rooms, gendered uniforms, gendered spaces, networks, those types of things. And the last group is colleagues and customers. So this would be about interpersonal relationships, working in public-facing roles, all the way through to bullying and harassment. Adi, please tell us a little bit more about all of these in more detail. I think it'd be really helpful for people.
Okay, so we're going to start looking at systems. So the systems that you use to record employee data can present several challenges for a trans employee. So I've put some quite simple diagrams on the slide as an indication of what these challenges might be. The first of which is any database that you have may only have options for male and female as the gender options. And what that means is that any non-binary staff who are already in your organisation, or if people are thinking of applying to join you and they're on, say, a recruitment site, for instance, can't record their gender identity. And that's a sign really early on that that person may not be able to actually be out and comfortable in your workplace. Your systems might only allow for Mr., Mrs. or Ms., not MX or MX, which is a common non-gendered title. Or it might, force people to give a title when actually being Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. isn't that important anymore when you're gathering data on people. One thing to think about is if you're recruiting someone, how you might approach a situation where an employee's ID is in a different name to the one that they use at work. Could your recruitment HR systems cope with that? How would you support that person in that situation? It's very common for trans people to struggle to get ID in their correct gender. So, for instance, getting your driver's license changed or your passport changed, you need a letter from your GP or from a gender identity clinic. And if you have a GP who refuses to do that, which does happen, or if you're on a waiting list for a gender identity clinic, which at the moment the average waiting list to be seen just for the first time is about 2 years from first referral, then you're looking at potentially a large group of people who don't have ID in their right gender or in their right name. So you need to think about how your systems can flex and adapt to manage that. Again, thinking about systems, if you have a trans member of staff who wishes to change their details, is this easy to do? Can it be done without everyone in HR knowing or unnecessary approval from someone senior? Can staff ID cards be changed quickly and easily? In my experience, the way I approach this is, people get married or change their names for all sorts of different reasons in the workplace. So there's no reason why a system shouldn't be able to do it. But in my experience, the barriers can come up when someone is trans, pretty much purely for that reason. Whereas actually people changing the information about themselves, A, is something they should be able to do easily anyway, but B is just part of life for everyone. One thing to think about if we're thinking about the idea of dead naming is if an employee changes their details with you during the course of working for you, do their former records get sort of locked somehow so that nobody can access them? So I had an experience where, due to a strange an old bit of a database, my former name was visible on certain emails, even several years after I changed it. And it wasn't until a colleague pointed this out to me that I knew that this was the case. And it's often, in my experience, funny little bits of systems where they try and talk to each other, and an IT system, one bit might be a bit older and one might be a bit newer, where that integrity of the data isn't being looked at very closely. And it doesn't feel very nice for that to happen. I was fortunate that the situation where that happened was with an employer who was very supportive of me, but I could have been made to feel very unsafe in that situation with my former name being revealed. Whatever your context, and systems and data are often challenging because we want them to be flexible and work like people, but then also they sort of have to work like a system as well, is start checking your systems now. So don't wait for a trans employee to have to find out that changing their name on your system takes 3 different emails and several layers of sign off, when actually it's something that could be done really easily if people thought about it. The trans community, especially non-binary people, are constantly coming up against systems that won't record who we are, or who are clunky and slow, or hold on to strange bits of information that they don't need to. And it's not only frustrating, but if it's part of your first experience with an employer, that can be a warning sign that actually you might not be safe there. And if you're a representative of that employer and you're thinking about trans colleagues or potential trans recruits, you don't want that message to be to them that everything with you is going to be a challenge and they're going to have to fight every step of the way. They need to feel that you're going to flex your systems to make them feel welcome and included, because that's the point. Okay, so we're going to look at buildings and facilities now, which a lot of the time is toilets, and I feel like I spend a lot of my life talking about toilets, but that's where we are. Buildings and facilities are an area that a lot of people get quite anxious about. As soon as you mention toilets and changing rooms when you're talking about trans people, I find lots of people start to get quite uptight about it. As with the systems point, this is something that us in the trans community think and worry about kind of all the time, really. Toilets in particular can be a real access issue. So there was a time a few years ago when I basically had a map in my head of all the cafes in London that had accessible unisex toilets, so that I knew I could safely go to the loo. And I mean, there is actually an app that trans people have built in order to record where accessible unisex toilets are, that's sort of crowdsourced. But it shouldn't be that difficult just to find a bathroom to go to, but it is. Non-gendered toilets really help, because then whatever gender you are, you can use the toilet, hopefully wash your hands, and then get on with your day, which is kind of all we want from a bathroom, really. So the best practice is non-gendered toilets, but not everyone can do that right now. There might be reasons to do with the building, to do with costs, all kinds of things. So what can you do instead? So what you need to think about is how you can make it clear to everybody that your bathrooms are safe and inclusive spaces, that you're not going to get in a situation where a trans person is, shouted at or worse by another member of staff and told that they shouldn't be using that toilet. That is not the situation you want to have happening. So the key is to make it clear, maybe in a trans inclusion policy or in your toilet signs or in your code of conduct. Different kind of contexts will work for different places, that staff should use the toilet that they feel most comfortable using, and that you have a zero tolerance approach to transphobic comments and behaviour. What that does is it kind of sets your stall out and makes it clear what you expect of people, and it also helps your trans colleagues feel that they've got policies and procedures they can lean on if they need to, in order to sort of be safe. It's the same approach with changing rooms. I mean, ideally, you'd want individual cubicles that anyone can use, but not everyone can do that right now. Again, a lot of people are in repurposed buildings, or they don't have money to sort of refit everything. So similarly, you need that clear communication, as you do with toilets, about the fact that the spaces are trans inclusive and you expect people to behave as per your code of conduct. Quite a common suggestion that I see from some workplaces is that trans staff should use the accessible toilet, as they're often already a sort of separate space with a basin and a mirror. Sometimes they have a shower in, that kind of thing. You need to be careful offering that as a solution, though, because while individual trans staff might agree with their manager to maybe use the accessible toilet for a time, or it feels more comfortable for them at that moment, what you don't want to do is make that sort of the trans toilet, because what that does is it outs anyone going in there as trans, which they may not want. But it also communicates that trans men and trans women aren't welcome in the gendered facilities. So you need to think about, while it can seem like a kind of convenient solution, you need to think about what it's actually communicating. So be careful around that. One note on uniforms: if you have gendered uniforms, then changing which uniform a staff member wears should, like with your data systems, be quite a quick and easy process. It should be seen as exactly the same as if someone needs, different size trousers or whatever. It should be a very simple process. You may have trans staff who feel more comfortable wearing a sort of male, in inverted commas, uniform one day and women's uniform the next. If that's the case, let them have two uniforms. It's not a big deal. You view it exactly the same way as if, you make sure everyone has several sets. You just do it just with gendered ones. Okay. All right. So the final of the sort of common challenges is colleagues and customers. In my experience, this is where most of our requests for advice at Inclusive Employers come from regarding trans people. And this is particularly for organisations who have staff who might be public facing or sort of externally facing, working with customers, etc. The common challenges here range from what I'd class as sort of well-meaning ignorance, all the way up to outright bullying and harassment. Thinking about the sort of things that just I've experienced personally, it could be being misgendered on the phone by a customer service agent, being given directions to the wrong toilet by a member of staff, or possibly my favourite, arguing with me on the phone because he refused to believe I was who I said I was from my emails because of how my voice sounded. That was a very interesting discussion to have with somebody who refused to believe that I was me. Turns out it's actually quite hard to have that argument with someone because it ends up getting quite existential. Anyway, so some of the ways to approach this could be, make sure you upskill your staff in trans inclusion. So trans inclusion can work quite well in this sort of format that we're doing now, like a webinar or a short e-learning course, just to get those very basic levels of foundation knowledge out there and to start catching any misconceptions early in people. And then you can sort of build on that later to something sort of a bit more in depth. Your bullying and harassment policy could specifically reference an example of transphobia, partly so you're setting that expectation really clearly, partly so that people know what transphobia looks like, because they might not. But that also supports your trans staff to feel that they'll be backed up if they raise a concern. And that's really important. Make it clear across your organisation that all staff are expected to abide by the Equality Act and your code of conduct or bullying and harassment policies, or however you communicate that. Upskilling your HR team so they can support managers. I've recently spent some time with HR business partners, upskilling them in trans inclusion. And actually the HR business partners are in a really pivotal role for this, because they're spending a lot of their day working with, supporting and advising managers out in the rest of the organisation. So they've got an opportunity to really increase the awareness of and upskill people in trans inclusion through their role, so they can be really pivotal people to have on board. If you celebrate particular diversity dates in the calendar, use them as a chance to increase awareness of trans identities. So for instance, if you're doing something for LGBT History Month, then you might be sort of profiling some role models, for instance, include trans people in that, so that you're increasing that visibility of trans people. You might want to celebrate Trans Day of Visibility at the end of March, or you might want to support Trans Day of Remembrance in November. Just start thinking about increasing people's awareness and visibility of the trans community, and that we exist. And of course, the experts on trans inclusion are us, the trans community. So when you're thinking about attraction and recruitment at different phases of your employee life cycle, think about how you can remove the often subtle barriers that may be preventing trans people from joining your workforce. If you're fortunate enough to have some trans colleagues who are willing to be out about it and to give their advice and to give you feedback on what the experience has been like for them, really cherish that feedback, because that will be really invaluable, and they can really help you make genuine change that will make a tangible difference. If you don't have trans colleagues in your organisation who are out, or who might not want to, that's okay. Consider who you can bring in from outside to give that that understanding and that personal experience to help shape what you're doing. Okay, so that's quite enough from me. We've got a good chunk of time for questions. So Debbie and I are going to look over what people have been submitting now.
Yeah, so I've made a note of a lot of the questions that have come through, but do keep adding questions. Now we've reached this section. So Adi, one point Mel made was that makes sense. She found something you said really helpful. And I think, Mel, that was relating to the uniforms, and I think it was to do with uniforms and or toilet. So that was a positive comment. We had a couple of comments around data. I'm going to go first to Joanne Ash's question, which was, when you were presenting the data around the research, around the impact and exclusion in the workplace.
Yeah.
Joanne asked, did employers give reasons why they'd be less likely to employ a trans person?
They didn't, but in my experience, it would be a combination of, to be honest, transphobia, an actual bias, real conscious bias. But I think a lot of it is from a nervousness around not knowing what to do, or not knowing how to work with trans people, and that putting people off from, say, recruiting them, or from including them more in their workplace.
Okay, brilliant. We've just had a really quick one here. Hannah asked, can you repeat the non-gender titles?
Yeah, so the most common non-gender title is MX. So it's big M, little x, and it's pronounced MX. That's if you, it's quite fun actually when you're having to sign up for various things, and you have to sign up for everything now. If you want to look at a pair of shoes, they want all your personal data, is to look on their drop down and see if they have MX as an option. So that's quite an easy win in terms of offering MX as a title. The other option is to just remove titles altogether, so people don't have to give one. But if you are particularly wedded to having titles as part of the data you collect on people, or your database system says it must be in there, then adding MX is a good way to just make sure people can feel included.
Brilliant, thank you. So these questions around data, there was one early on from Elizabeth, which was, we're thinking of moving to gender recorded at birth in some of our networks. And then a related question from Felicia was, the gender field in their system is linked to HMRC. So they have to add more fields to get the breadth of what they're looking for. And does anyone have any advice on that? So they're sort of similar-ish type of things, like what should we be recording, and where should it be going?
So, I mean, ideally, if you're recording this, so if you're asking people for their gender identity, the best way to do it is to have sort of a tick box type option, or drop down, or however you record it on your database, of something like male, female, something else, and having a free text box so people can type in what they want, and then the standard sort of prefer not to disclose or prefer not to say option. The type in sort of free text box is the best way to do it, because what that means is that people can write in whatever word feels right for them. And it means that, as I was saying earlier, because language changes and adapts and is sort of different for different parts of the trans community, having that free text box means you can kind of capture everything. HMRC, when we're thinking about things like pensions, there is only two genders according to HMRC, and that is male or female. So I guess the workaround for that could be that if you have to keep that field the same way because of that link, that you maybe put a statement in saying, we recognise that there are more than two genders, or that people might identify in different ways, but we have to give one or other of these options because of pensions, for instance. And then at least people can choose which one is the best, worst option, I suppose. But it means that you're saying to the employee, we recognise that this isn't ideal, but we have to capture it this way. So that might be a workaround.
Have you seen, Elizabeth's posted here, HMRC have to have a male-female on their system until 2020. When pension ages align, I work with the Gender, Civil Service, Trans and Intersex Network, and we'll be working with HMRC to look at this. So that's fantastic. Really positive. Yeah.
That's really brilliant. Fantastic. Well done, Elizabeth.
Yeah. So a question from Georgina was around trans inclusion policies. And I think Claire from Inclusive Employers has already responded to that one, that we have a template, trans inclusion policy, which was developed with the Government Equalities Office. And as we were saying earlier, that the guidance around that, and that is going to be refreshed in November. So we're really excited about that. So do look out for it. Although if you're a member, you can access our existing pack at the moment if you wanted to. Jess says they've got no trans people that they're aware of in their organisation. So how do they go about promoting trans awareness?
So, well, I guess it depends how skilled you feel yourself. So there's one way you can approach it, and you can go out to the organisation, you can say, this is something we think is important, but we're all at the beginning of our understanding of this, and start with some sort of small positive steps. So that might be something like having a lunch and learn around trans inclusion to just get people thinking about it and talking about it. It might be something a bit higher up and more strategic, where you make a commitment to inclusion, and that includes, different gender identities, races, backgrounds, etc. There's a few ways you can approach it. It will depend what feels right for you, but you can be honest about the fact that you think this is important, but you don't know much yet, and then sort of start that positive movement altogether, and start upskilling people in sort of the basics. The thing you need to think about is that if you're an organisation where, as far as you're aware, you don't have any trans people working for you, and you may do, but you may not, that the responsibility is on you to try and make that workplace feel safe and exciting, so that trans people who are out there in the workplace, or who are looking for jobs, think, oh, actually, I want to work for these people. So you can do quite a lot in terms of getting your name out there as an organisation who thinks this is important. So something that I've done before, and that I know that other trans people do, is if I'm looking at an employer, I'll have a look on their website and I'll read their job adverts and that kind of thing. And I might have a look at their diversity inclusion section on their website. I'll see what's on there, but I'll also have a look on their social media and see what sort of things they might be tweeting about, what they're celebrating, what they're talking about. And if there are elements on there where they might be, celebrating LGBT History Month, for instance, I would think, oh, okay, that's a good sign. That's a sort of tick against that employer's name, where that might be a workplace where I'm able to feel safe and to be included. And I think there's a lot to be said for being open about the fact that you think this is important, but you're at the beginning of the journey, rather than trying to make it sound perfect and amazing, getting everything right now. I think people respond to genuineness. So you need to think about how that might work for your particular organisation.
So I think an interesting question that Katie asked was around that they have unisex uniforms, mm-hmm. but they tend to be quite big and baggy.
Okay.
And so when a trans woman's wearing them, it can cause misgendering. So they were asking about what you did in that situation.
So, I mean,
it's a hard one.
That's an interesting question, because you could either flip it on its head and say, why does unisex have to mean big and baggy? So is that an assumption that I said, we, the collective we, are making in terms of, oh, unisex clothing must look like X, Y, Z? So it might be, I mean, you might not have this luxury, but you might be able to go and actually rethink your uniform. Or there might be ways you could offer people an opportunity to maybe customize the uniforms a bit, or have pronoun badges on, so that people can see, she, her pronouns, he, him, they, them, etc. There might be little visible cues that you can add to the uniform that help people feel a bit more comfortable. But that's a tricky one, and I don't think there's a sort of perfect answer. But also, you need to think that if that person's being misgendered, then it's not taking the uniform out of the equation. What else can you do to stop that from happening? So can you upskill people so that they're not assuming someone's gender just by how they look? Could you upskill people so that they get into the habit of asking people what their pronouns are when they speak to them? Are there other things you can change in terms of behaviour and training people that will make that a more comfortable space for everybody, that doesn't mean necessarily an overhaul of what the uniform is?
Okay, so thank you for that. Jess said, have you got any advice about, or has anyone got any experience of people opting out of trans awareness training on religious grounds?
I haven't experienced that. I guess I would see that. I would be interested to know what the actual argument was that they weren't taking part. And I would want to think about that in the context of any other training that the organisation was offering. Because in my experience, I wouldn't see that there would be a particularly strong case to be made for that to be to have much weight to it. I guess what I would think with that is, if that's one particular employee, is there something else going on there is that the reason they're giving because that's a genuine reason, or is that the reason they're giving because it means they don't have to have that conversation? So I guess if it's a group of people saying it, then that's a different approach to if it's one person saying it. You might want to think about knowing a bit more about the context of that. That would be my suggestion.
Brilliant. So this was a question from Farah about how do you deal with if you're taking phone calls, if you're on a customer service type of role, identifying people's gender on the phone. For example, they've had experience of where people might impersonate their partner. I was on the phone to Virgin Media the other day, and they will only deal with my partner in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
And so I guess Farah must be in a situation where they need to identify somebody and know that they're speaking to the right person. And so how would they go around that?
So in terms of just generally, before I sort of touch on that point, if you work with people or you are someone who does a lot of work over the phone, it's a relatively easy change to just get into the habit of training people so that, the standard scripts you say when you answer the phone or when you're calling a customer or whatever it is, you ask someone how they would like to be addressed. So you could say, for instance, we have, Reginald Smith on our records. How would you like to be referred to today? And if they go, oh, Mr. Smith, please, then that's what you call them. If they say, oh, call me Reg, then you call them Reg. So that you could change your script so that it gives people the opportunity to say how they'd like to be referred to. If you've got a concern around security, then you would see that that's not really a trans issue, that's a security issue, right? So it's about what safeguards have you got in place to make sure that, I couldn't ring up and impersonate my grandma in order to get access to her bank account or whatever. That's not about whether someone's trans or not. It's about how secure are your systems and what are you putting in place to prevent that from being the case. So with it, passwords or set dates or other things. So think about it as a security issue, not as a trans issue, if that makes sense.
There's a lot of questions about toilets, but before we go on to those, Barrett was saying, have you got any advice, regardless of the context, so whether it's in work or out of work, of what cis people can do to support their trans colleagues to feel comfortable with their gender identity?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm very happy that you've asked that.
That's great.
So I think one thing that you can do as cisgender people is upskill yourself, recognise that you will have knowledge gaps around this, and rather than being a bit embarrassed and awkward about it, grab it as an opportunity to upskill yourself and get to know more. There's a lot of information out there now. Make sure you're getting it from reputable sources, because there is some not so great information out there about the trans community right now, unfortunately. Upskill yourself, learn more, challenge yourself. Think about things like the gender binary. How does that apply to you in your life as a cis person? So have there been instances where the common thing that people have experienced is where maybe they were a kid and they really liked a certain hobby or activity or a TV program, and the message that they got from people around them was that wasn't okay for them to like that, whatever it was, because of their gender. So I don't know, little boys shouldn't play with dollies or whatever. So start to think about, in your own experience and also out in the world, where is this very rigid idea of what gender is coming in, and how can you challenge that? Can you think about it differently? Can you expand your perception a bit? And really, when it comes to supporting trans friends or colleagues, is in situations out in the world, as we've seen from some of the stats today and just generally, it's not great for trans people right now. There's a fair bit of increased and more visible hostility towards the trans community at the moment for various reasons. As a cis person, you've got an opportunity to stand up for us, to stand by us, to challenge people who, there are instances I know where if I challenge someone who was being maybe transphobic, there's a bit of their brain that wouldn't have to listen to me because I'm trans. So they've already kind of devalued my perspective. But if a cisgender person challenged them, then they're maybe more likely to listen, because as a cisgender person in that situation, you've probably got more power. And that's an enormous privilege for you to have. And it's a great opportunity for you to challenge people and to encourage them to come along with you. And that also means that as trans people, we're not constantly trying to educate and upskill the whole world just in order to live in it, and instead we can get on with our lives. So those are some sort of top line things that you can do, but be curious and challenge yourself and think about, it's not just the gender binary applies to trans people, it applies to everyone. So start thinking about that and expanding your horizons.
Where's the best place to look for information?
So the best place to go to is trans people ourselves.
Yeah.
Trans-led charities, social media. There's a lot of trans people writing on Twitter, who are on YouTube, and that's the best place to go for that information, because it's coming from us. So us in the community. And you'll find that, like every community, there are differences of opinion and there are different perspectives on things, because that's just human. But then you're getting a real sense of what we are thinking about and talking about as trans people, not a sort of abridged or sanitized or incorrect even version.
And is it better to go through media rather than speak to people individually?
I think for a lot of things, yes. I do this as a job, so I answer questions about being trans all the time, but we're not all trans Google, right? Like every trans person doesn't want to educate everyone they bump into. They probably just want to get on with their lives. So bear that in mind as well. There's information out there, or there are people like me who don't mind blathering on about it, who you can ask, but don't see every trans person as a, exciting zoo exhibit that you can ask questions about, or as the source of all knowledge, because that's just not how it works.
Okay, thank you. And I think a really inspiring sort of message for the cis people on this webinar about what they can do next. That's amazing. These questions about toilets, I think in general, there's sort of a question about, is gender neutral the best to have for all toilets? And what would you do in cases where there were sort of religious reasons, for example, where someone might want to have a binary toilet? And then there was another question which was more about, we've got sort of self-contained toilets with basins and so on at the moment, but they're gendered, male and female. Should those become gender neutral?
So short answer, yes. Gender neutral toilets is the ideal for everyone. If you think about I talk about toilets all the time, but the toilets in your house are gender neutral, and that's fine. It's only when we go into the public space that suddenly everyone starts panicking about who's in what toilets.
Strange, isn't it?
But actually, I mean, fundamentally what you want is a clean bathroom, and to just, use it, leave, the end. It's, we don't want to spend our lives in there. So if you've got the option to make all of your toilets gender neutral, that's fantastic. Now, I've had the question around, there might be a reason why, maybe a religious reason why someone might want a single gender option. So one of the suggestions for that is, so if you think of sort of maybe a typical office building, there will be men's toilets, women's toilets, and an accessible loo, which is normally like a discrete cubicle. It's a sort of a separate room. So it could be that if you made all your toilets gender neutral, you could say, if people particularly want or don't feel comfortable using the unisex bathroom, then they can use the accessible toilet because it's just one cubicle. Some of you might be lucky enough to be able to sort of throw facilities money at this and be able to have, separate discrete cubicles so everyone just uses whatever they like. That's the ideal, but that's not always the case. So it's just about thinking, how can you include everybody? Often the easiest way to do that is to de-gender your toilets. One thing I will say is, think about how you're going to do it. Depending on the organisation, you might find that people actually get quite anxious and stressed about this possibility. In reality, the vast majority of people are actually fine. If you walk into a building and all the toilets are gender neutral, you don't even think about it, you just use them. But if you've worked somewhere and then it changes, that's when the challenges can come up, because people get stressed about that change.
So I suppose a lot of it's around fear of safety. For some reason, that seems to come up. When you talk, Bear, about the difference between the home environment and the public environment, I can think, others might want to chip in if they've heard of other reasons why people are not comfortable, using gender neutral toilets. But generally, I think it's a point of safety people feel. So maybe it'd be worth you sort of saying something about the likelihood of something happening.
Yeah, so the safety question does come up. But I think the key thing with that is to split that away from the trans issue.
Yeah.
So if your toilets aren't safe, they aren't safe. Like, that's a bigger issue that you've got. They're not going to suddenly become unsafe because everyone's using them. So if you think about the workplace, for instance, if you had something happen where a member of staff assaulted another member of staff, regardless of whether that happened in the toilet or in the kitchen or anywhere, that's your problem. The toilet isn't the problem, the behaviour is the problem. It's the same as in public. Like, if the thing that I hear quite a lot is, what if someone pretended to be trans and went into a women's toilet and did XYZ? But one, if someone really wants to do that, then they're going to do it anyway, and that's why the law exists. But two, it becomes a spurious argument to make to prevent trans people from using toilets. So you need to be careful about the route that you're going down with that. So just, I guess the thing with so much of trans inclusion is it's very easy to get fixated on things being just a trans issue. But actually, everything here, all the things that I've talked about today in terms of systems, in terms of facilities, in terms of interpersonal skills, these are all things that happen already. People change their names, people need different uniforms, people need different kinds of bathrooms or access. People want to feel safe in the workplace, people want to feel included and valued. It's all the same, it's just applying it to trans people. We're not, aliens from another planet. We have all the sort of skills that you need in order to make trans inclusion happen in your workplace. You already have them, you just have to apply them.
Thank you. That's very practical. There was another question. Someone mentioned that they'd seen she, he on people's email signatures and was asking whether that's good practice. And I think that might be possibly the last question. We'll see how we get on for time.
Yeah, so increasingly people are putting their pronouns in their email signatures, which is great. It's another sort of quick win. So the way to think about it is, the reason to do that is that it shows that you're not making the assumption that whoever reads your email knows what gender you are. So there's a good message behind it. It helps people think about that thing I was saying earlier, where you can't assume what someone's pronouns are. And also, if you think just practically about emails, if you've been receiving emails from someone whose name is Sam, you might not know what gender that person is. So if they've got pronouns in their email signature and then you chat to them on the phone, then that's giving you more information about that person and you're sort of ready to speak to them. But what it also shows is that in your organisation, you're actually thinking about pronouns and trans inclusion. One thing to be cautious of with the pronouns in the email signature is it should never be sort of mandated. You shouldn't sort of make everyone do it. It should be we encourage people to put their pronouns in their email signatures, maybe with a bit of, this is what pronouns mean. These are the common pronouns that people use, she, he, they, etc. And then people can choose to if they want to. And what you'll probably find is that once a few people start doing it, it builds momentum and lots of people start doing it. So the reason why I say don't make it mandatory is A, there may be trans people in your organisation who don't feel able to put the pronouns they would like people to use in their email signature just yet, or they might not feel comfortable putting them in their signature and that going out to external people, for instance. Or some people just might not quite be ready yet. So that's just two things to think about. In my experience, once the sort of ball gets rolling, people get involved in it, and it's a sort of positive change across the organisation. But that's just something to sort of bear in mind.
Any last questions? We've got a couple of minutes left. So do type in. I can see that Claire from Inclusive Employers is answering some of your questions. So that's really helpful as well in the chat box function. I think we've got one person type, a couple of people typing. So maybe we could squeeze in one more question, but it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you, Addie. Do you have any advice on starting to think about non-binary inclusion in an organisation? And that is due to the nature of the work they do. They hire only women and have a very binary understanding of gender. So they really need to start to consider that. That question came up again. Thanks for repeating that one. And I think that's probably the one that we should focus on as we finish.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously under the Equality Act, there is provision for making roles specifically one gender or another. And there's very specific reasons you have to meet in order for that to be okay. So I guess what you need to think about in your organisation is, what does that actually mean? So why are you doing that? Could you say in your job adverts, this is advertised as women only because of the Equality Act? I can't remember the exact part of it, but for this reason, there's this is a gender only role. However, we encourage people of non-binary identities to join. Or think about, the reasons why you're advertising those jobs to be a specific gender, just revisiting why you're doing that and maybe thinking a bit bigger about it. So you might review it and go, actually, no, we want to keep doing this, in which case, fine. But you might revisit it and go, actually, we want to think about this a bit differently. I'm aware that that's quite a complex question to answer in a webinar. So I'd be really interested in maybe picking that up later and sort of seeing where you go with it.
Yeah, well, we can have a recording, we can chase people up around that. We're getting some really, really positive comments from people. So Addy, it's gone down really, really well. Good. So thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank you all really for contributing, for being so engaged, for your amazing questions. And I hope that many of you will join us in tomorrow's webinar. So that's about embedding inclusion. And we'll be featuring Jen Barnett, who's the Director of Diversity, Inclusion and Wellbeing at Grant Thornton. And she's going to be talking about how Grant Thornton are embedding inclusion into all the functions in their business. So it'd be fabulous if some of you were able to come to that as well. Before we go, thanks again to McDonald's and to all of our members and supporters of Inclusive Employers. This is really turning out to be the most amazing National Inclusion Week we've ever had. And if you want to find out more about us, if this has piqued your interest, we offer membership, training, consultancy, and you can go to our website to find out more. But for now, thank you so much. Thanks for your lovely comments, and have a wonderful rest of the day and the rest of National Inclusion Week. Bye for now.
Bye.